Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. Here he proposed a brilliantly simple theory which sought to explain the diversity of all living species on Earth. Darwin formulated his argument with the watch analogy of William Paley in mind. Paley reasoned that the existence of a functioning watch, like that of life itself, clearly pointed toward an intelligent designer. However, Darwin argued that living things, like a watch, functioned as a result of many smaller steps and components. He proposed that each living system was assembled gradually over great periods of time, tiny step by tiny step. Darwin recognized that it was the intelligence of the watchmaker that created his tangible creation. But Darwin thought perhaps living things could self-assemble better and better systems if given eons of time, through a mechanism Darwin coined in his book The Origin of Species, natural selection. While Darwin knew nothing of DNA information at the time, he arrived at a simple and straightforward idea. He proposed that natural selection took existing living organisms, which would discard harmful variations by the death of the organism, while building on rare beneficial improvements through reproduction. This process he also called survival of the fittest. The concept was simple and straightforward. However, for the theory to remain in good standing, these mechanisms of gradual variations that would preserve the good while discarding the bad over the millions of years must in fact be true. If not, Darwin himself recognized that the theory would fail. Darwin recognized this reality. He wrote in his book Origin of Species, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Darwin noted that at the present time he could find no such case. Darwin's theory argued that the process of natural selection through random mutations could build more and more complex organisms without the need for design, purpose, or intelligence. The theory argues that over time, genetics will gain information and complexity which will cause simple organisms such as bacteria to ultimately evolve into higher and higher life forms, including human beings. The theory does not directly deal with the origin of life, as natural selection can only act upon existing life forms. But Darwin did imagine life first emerging on a primitive planet in what he called primordial soup. Here, the fossil record shown at the top in green indicates those species which are alive today. While there have been many extinction events throughout time, the majority of all the animals found in the fossil layers remain alive today. The yellow indicates, for illustration purposes, the known fossil record at the time Darwin wrote his book, The Origin of Species. This is going back to the Cambrian layer. The bottom here shows a theory that argues that common ancestry of all living things should find intermediary forms that go from simple to more complex. The dotted lines do not represent actual evidence, but represented the expectations of Darwin's theory. Many scientists today disregard or belittle any dissent toward their pet theories. However, Darwin was always willing to accept opposing perspectives. Darwin openly acknowledged the evidentiary gaps his theory had with actual fossil evidence. He knew many disparities pointed out by the critics needed to be answered. First, Darwin himself acknowledged that if every living thing had emerged by presumably millions and millions of small, gradual variations over eons of time, then the Earth must have been swarming with life. Life comprised of nearly unimaginable variation, as one life form slowly emerged from a precursor to a new distinct form. Seeing simple organisms move from kingdom to phylum to class to order to family to genus to species, But this was not the evidence of the fossil record, especially not that at the time of the 19th century, nor, as we shall find, is it as of today. Darwin explained in his book, quote, "The number of intermediate varieties, which must have formerly existed, had to be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology surely does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. Second, the abrupt arrival of living organisms immediately after the Precambrian layer, which today we call this event the Cambrian Explosion, revealed enormously complex organisms, such as the horseshoe crab, with an incredible 10 complex eyes, suddenly emerging without any precursors in any fossils. These and many other complex organisms seem to have emerged from thin air. This was in no way helpful toward defending the new theory, as it directly seemed to disprove it. Darwin acknowledged such critiques as valid, stating, "The abrupt manner in which whole groups of species suddenly appear in certain formations has been urged by several paleontologists as a fatal objection to the belief in transmutation, or evolution, of species. If numerous species belonging to the same genre or families have really started life all at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection." As a third objection to the theory, even historical scientists of the 19th century were well aware that any large-scale variations that were ever observed in living organisms were found to cause harm, and they had never been observed to make any living organism better. Such occurrences were proposed by the theory, which must have been happening all the time in the past, were not happening in the present. Louis Agassiz, a critic of Darwin's new theory, pointed out that such changes in living things are observed to cause, quote, "degeneration," or for the organism to, quote, "to become sterile." Agassiz pointed out that such changes would cause, quote, "like monstrosities, they would die out." Fourth, the fossil layers reveal mass extinctions and not transmutations or evolution. One geologic period, called the Paleozoic era, has 6 time periods combined within it. But at its end, suddenly, the entire period comes to an extinction, which is called the Permian extinction. Later, massive numbers of completely new and never seen before organisms, including dinosaurs and turtles, emerged just like the others had during the Cambrian Explosion. Adam Sedgwick, also a critic of Darwin's theory, pointed out that this pattern of arrival of new forms, without any precursor form in the fossil record, followed by mass extinctions, which were evidenced in the fossil record as well, were found to not be the exception, but to be the rule. As a fifth criticism, fossil evidence uncovered a pattern radically different from that the theory proposed. Instead of simple organisms, followed by more and more complex organisms, the fossils revealed first major and sudden emergence of whole organisms, followed by more smaller scale diversifications. As an example, the trilobite emerged suddenly in the Cambrian layer with enormous complexity, including complex eyes. Later, trilobite fossils indicate minor modifications of the body type, but no new form. Trilobites remained to be trilobites. Unfortunately for Darwin, it seemed the very fossil evidence he needed to prove his theory was best used to disprove the new theory. Of course, all the evidence seemed to point against Darwin's theory, but of course, he had proposed a solution for the dilemma. He called the fossil record, as it had been discovered in the 19th century, as being imperfect, stating, "The explanation lies as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geologic record. He went on to state that it would be up to the future generations to make the discoveries that would ultimately vindicate his theory. Darwin was right. Over the centuries, many more fossils were in fact discovered, thousands and thousands of them. But would these suffice to ultimately vindicate his theory? Here are some of the fossil discoveries. In Greenland in the 1930s, there were tetrapod finds of four-legged life forms such as frogs and lizards. And then in the 1990s, many bird fossils, complete with feather impressions, were found in China. In Pakistan, whale fossils were unearthed. But it was the Burgess Shale fossil discovery of 1909 that was the most significant. The Burgess Shale had uncovered novel and massively complex organisms that had never been found anywhere else on Earth. Unfortunately for Darwin's theory, just like the many organisms that had been found in the Cambrian layers of the Cambrian Explosion, these organisms too offered no precursor forms in their earlier layers. The Burgess Shale had made the fossils more problematic for Darwin's theory and not less, because now there were more incredibly complex life forms that had to be explained without the benefit of any precursor fossils in the record. Here is a graphical representation of the difference between actual fossil evidence and the ideas that Darwin proposed through the theory of evolution and the common ancestry of simple life forms becoming more complex and going from the base upward towards more complexity at the ends. On the left side, you'll see that various unique animal groups are found throughout the fossil layers. But here, for purposes for illustration, you can see that you find them throughout different groups, and at different points, certain species of that unique animal group become extinct. But you'll find at the very top, a great majority of them are alive today. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this rule, such as the dinosaurs that have gone extinct. If you look at the theory of evolution, you find that the basic, most quote-unquote simple life forms are at the very bottom, and they move upwards, gaining information, gaining complexity as they move up to the very top where they have the most complexity. Let's apply this logic to an observed process of breeding canines or dogs. It's been assumed that most dogs have come from a distant relative of the gray wolf. And then through artificial selection, which is just simply man breeding the dogs as opposed to nature breeding the dogs, we have all the various varieties of dogs alive today. But at the base of this tree is the gray wolf, extending upwards towards the breeds of all the dogs known today. The bottom portion of our illustration indicates the part that is the fossil record, which is estimated to go back approximately 40,000 years for the canine breed. With the benefit of genetics, we can look at the idea that Darwin proposed, focusing on the dog. We find that the gray wolf at the beginning had the most genetic information. And then what happens as you breed the dogs to isolate certain characteristics to gain the various breeds that we see today, isolate or remove certain types of information from the DNA to cause the breeds to go from gray wolf to German Shepherd to Poodle to Chihuahua. And as you do this, mutations or loss of information increase. This circular representation is a great way to look at how all the various dog breeds are here. They begin at the base of the original created kind, in this case, the wolf, the gray wolf. And from these genes, through artificial selection, the many breeds that we see today of dogs are generated. Darwin's tree finds at the top branches the most complex organisms. If we're to apply the same logic to what we actually observe in genetics in the dog kind, you'll find that the gray wolf is at the top. And then downward, as you remove and make the genetics more bottlenecked, you get the various breeds that we find today. So this inverts Darwin's tree of life. And where Darwin thought smaller changes would start and build towards bigger changes, we find what we actually observe, which is the bigger changes are early, and then as the species become more and more selected to their environments, the species coming from the original created kind gain smaller and smaller genetic changes. Just as the gray wolf has the most complete and the most complex genetic makeup, as it goes forward and you build the various breeds, you actually lose genetics. The advent of DNA information and the understanding of genetics has shown that Darwin's theory did not, in fact, become vindicated by the fossil record. And it is not vindicated by genetics either. If you were to look at the way actual biology functions, it actually inverts Darwin's tree of life, and we find that the highest genetic order belongs to the original created kinds, and the lowest genetic order belongs to the species that are generated from the original kind.